The Cold War turned paranoia into policy. After 1945, American intelligence treated psychological warfare as an existential battleground, convinced that Soviet and Chinese brainwashing could be weaponized against the West. The CIA seeded a technical obsession with behavior modification, building labs, hiring contractors, and even experimenting on unwitting subjects. Project BLUEBIRD, later renamed Artichoke, emerged in 1950 as a directive to investigate interrogation techniques, narcotics, hypnosis, and ways to break resistance. By 1953, that effort had expanded into MKULTRA, a sprawling, compartmented program run through dozens of front organizations and contractors. This is not abstract history. It is a ledger of human damage, shattered minds, seared memories, people left hollow-eyed and mute. In this film, we trace the administrative orders that authorized LSD dosing, sensory deprivation, electroshock, and covert drugging. We follow the money trails and contractor contracts that enabled grotesque experiments in hospitals, prisons, and universities. We test claims against primary evidence, declassified memos, experiment protocols, payment ledgers, and the Inspector General reports. We weigh survivor testimonies and operative affidavits against institutional records and Freedom of Information releases. When documents are missing, we document that absence. The deliberate shredding and destruction that raised alarm in the 1970s and spawned lawsuits and congressional probes. Our stance is forensic and skeptical. We amplify testimony where it intersects with paper trails or corroborated witness networks, and we note when claims rest on memory alone. Expect meticulous parsing of timelines and directives. Act 1 opens the original BLUEBIRD files, names the architects, and follows the first experiments that turned Cold War fear into clinical cruelty. This matters because victims still live with the scars of state-sanctioned cruelty, and those scars shape lives decades later. The early MKUltra tests read like clinical Gothic. Deliberate drugging, staged interrogations, and laboratories turned into abattoirs of the mind. Field teams poured LSD, barbiturates, scopolamine, and experimental stimulants into cups and cocktails, watching for fissures in behavior as if cataloging insect reactions under a lens. Hypnosis sessions ran alongside chemical cocktails, technicians prompting hypnotic commands while subjects reeled in a narcotic fog. A grotesque duet of suggestion and pharmacology. Sensory deprivation tanks, windowless, echoing boxes, were used to strip people down to their nervous systems, producing hallucinations so violent witnesses described crawling insects and surgical lights behind their eyelids. Conditioning experiments used reward and punishment to shape reflexive obedience. Reinforcements were meted out like currency, punishments like surgical erasure. Covert dosing became routine. Unsuspecting bar patrons, unconsenting hospital patients, and prisoners received drugs without consent, as the program treated civilians as disposable test beds. Contractors, universities, private physicians, and research hospitals repackaged intelligence goals as clinical research, giving experiments academic sheen while sidestepping oversight. One survivor later testified in hushed courtroom recordings that she woke in a white ward with her mouth raw and the taste of acid still in her throat. Nurses insisted she had volunteered. She had no memory of consenting, only snapshots of fluorescent lights, the press of hands, and months of blank days like burned film. Operatives justified these breaches with Cold War rhetoric. If the Soviets could brainwash prisoners, the CIA argued it needed proactive techniques to resist or replicate it. That mission drifted into scientific hubris. Protocols multiplied, peer-reviewed language softened the brutality, and ethical checkpoints were bypassed in the name of national survival. Early successes were bureaucratic poison. Small behavioral changes were exaggerated as scalable, prompting deeper, more invasive protocols. A moral and legal crisis was inevitable. Families and physicians demanded answers as unexplained suicides and shattered patients accumulated on hospital lists, and whispers of state-sanctioned torture pushed the program further into secrecy and cover-up. Those reactions, lawsuits, leaked internal memos, and the first public allegations are the hinge that drives the investigation into the documents and hearings to come. The program spread like a malign growth, branching into dozens of sub-projects that hid under respectable names while destroying lives and bypassing ethical oversight. Internal memos map a lattice of objectives that read like a manual for ruin: break resistance, erase memory, implant commands, perfect interrogation, and weaponize vulnerability. Funding trails point to CI, a money funneled through front foundations such as the Human Ecology Fund, dispersed as grants and secret payments to universities, hospitals, and private laboratories that lent scientific legitimacy to what were, in practice, state-sponsored atrocities. Sidney Gottlieb and a short list of technical officers signed directives. Payment vouchers and contractor invoices show sums routed to research teams at Ivy League institutions and provincial clinics alike. The most grotesque laboratories were not basements of shadowy cults, but university wards and hospital corridors where prestige insulated cruelty. At McGill University, Ewan Cameron was effectively given a blank check to pursue de-patterning and psychic driving, protocols that combined high-dose electroconvulsive therapy, prolonged drug-induced sleep, sensory isolation, and relentless tape playback of repeating messages meant to overwrite personality. Patients described skull-rattling shocks, weeks of immobility under chemical torpor, and sensory starvation so complete the mind clawed for any sign of coherence. Other sub-projects used clinical euphemisms while testing scopolamine, barbiturates, stimulants, and industrial compounds, sometimes supplied by pharmaceutical companies like Sandoz, and sometimes improvised in labs. Operation Midnight Climax became a grotesque social experiment. Safe houses staffed by paid informants lured unwitting victims into rooms where one-way mirrors and hidden cameras recorded the cascade of hallucination after covert dosing. Memos and bank transfers reveal who approved payments and which institutions accepted them. Academic credentialing and hospital boards provided cover without asking hard questions. Contractors wrote reports that sanitized violence into data points, and peer-reviewed language often whitewashed sessions that left subjects fragmented and mute. That architecture compartmented, subcontracted, and bureaucratically deniable created plausible deniability while leaving a scattered paper trail of memos, receipts, and clinical notes that still connect names to acts. But the same structure also made deliberate erasure possible. As the program began to implode, paper trails were selectively shredded or vanished, setting the stage for the legal battles, congressional probes, and the unraveling that Act 3 will follow. When the program moved from secret ambition to public exposure, the response was surgical. In 1973, CIA leadership ordered files incinerated in a deliberate effort to choke the story at its source. The destruction was not total. A scattered set of financial ledgers, contractor invoices, and fragmentary memos survived because they had been routed through accounting channels or mistakenly archived outside operational files. Those ragged shards, payment vouchers, grant approvals, and thin project summaries became the brittle bones of evidence. In 1975, congressional inquiries ripped open the official veneer. The Rockefeller Commission and the Senate Church Committee forced testimony that read like criminal affidavits. Operatives admitting to clandestine dosing, to running safe houses where narcotics and sexual exploitation were used as instruments of observation, and to experimenting without consent on prisoners, hospital patients, and civilians. Survivor depositions filled the hearings with nightmarish detail, accounts of taped commands, chemical clouds that hollowed memory, and electroshock regimes that shattered personalities. Yet every admission landed against a backdrop of absence. Consent forms, comprehensive protocols, and centralized lists of subjects had been shredded or vanished, leaving gaps so wide the full scale and authorship of the abuses could not be cleanly mapped. Litigation became a scavenger hunt. Attorneys chased payment trails, subpoenaed contractors, and dragged forward clinicians and university officials who had cloaked cruelty in clinical language. Some suits produced small settlements and sealed acknowledgments. Others collapsed on the shoals of missing files and bureaucratic denials. Freedom of information releases in later decades peeled back more layers, revealing invoices to front foundations and travel logs that tied names to cities and safe houses. But the reconstruction was always partial, like trying to reassemble a fractured skeleton from scattered pieces. Taken together, operative confessions and survivor testimony establish a pattern of institutionalized cruelty, an architecture of experimentation and deceit. The remaining silence, the shredded directives and disappeared data, does not just obscure the record. It is an active part of the crime, a bureaucratic erasure that forces us to confront not only what was done, but what we will never fully know. The record, ragged and scorched by deliberate destruction, still delivers a bleak, prosecutorial verdict. What remains in ink, ledgers, and sworn memory shows a pattern of institutionalized cruelty, so methodical it reads like bureaucratic butchery. Proven beyond reasonable doubt are these core facts. 1. Systematic experimentation on unwitting people, civilians, prisoners, and hospital patients treated as disposable specimens. 2. Routine use of LSD and other psychoactive drugs administered covertly to induce hallucination, disorientation, and submission. 3. Brutal conditioning regimes, high-dose electroconvulsive therapy, prolonged drug-induced sleep, sensory deprivation, and tape-driven psychic driving aimed at erasing and rebuilding personality. 4. Collusion between the CIA, front foundations, universities, hospitals, and private physicians that obscured accountability while providing clinical cover. These conclusions are anchored by payment vouchers, memos, contractor reports, survivor affidavits, and operative testimony that intersect into a jagged, incontestable mosaic. Equally damning are the things that cannot be proven because files were incinerated. The full scale of victims, the complete chain of command linking senior officials to specific orders, comprehensive subject lists, undisclosed contractor projects, and the totality of long-term medical harm. Those absences are not benign gaps, but active erasures that turn culpability into a viscous, unresolved horror. That scorched verdict was followed by a messy, partial aftermath. A handful of legal settlements, apologies, and reforms that stitched limited protections onto a torn institutional body. Tortured survivors received some compensation while many injuries, psychic and cognitive, went unaddressed. The state offered explanations, but not full restitution. The public fallout split into two dangerous branches. One became a thicket of conspiracy fed by the remaining blanks. The other was a movement demanding concrete reforms, tightened human subject protections, mandatory informed consent, independent review boards, and expanded congressional oversight of clandestine programs. Those changes reduced bureaucratic immunities but never fully healed the moral wounds. Culturally, the MKUltra revelations hardened distrust of secret science and created metaphors that still stain political discourse. The lesson is surgical and stark. Secrecy enables atrocity. Bureaucratic compartmentalization diffuses responsibility, and deliberate record destruction forecloses justice. To separate verified history from speculation, insist on primary documents, corroborated testimony, and transparent chains of custody for records. The final obligation is ethical. Guard human dignity against state experiments, demand sunlight, and never let institutionalized cruelty slink back into darkness.